graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He currently works as a contractor on security cooperation policy, strategy, and training for the Department of the Army. And he also works with our friends at the Family Research Council, where he's a senior fellow for national security. Colonel Maginnis, welcome to today's issues.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Robert. Tim here with Jim. We appreciate you being our guest. What's keeping you busy nowadays?
Well, Tim, I just wrote a book, Deadly Consequences, How Cowards Are Pushing Women into Combat, and that's kind of got a lot of my attention, but certainly given the state of chaos in much of the Middle East, as you've been talking about, things just continue along the way.
Hey, talk about, your book is called Deadly Consequences. It's brand new, published by Regnery, and the subtitle is How Cowards Are Pushing Women into Combat. Talk about, first of all, the history of women in the military, particularly the Army, and then also the latest push to have them be involved in combat. Give us a little bit of the background.
Well, we've had women in the armed forces since really the Revolutionary War, but it wasn't until the mid-'70s that we had significant numbers begin to serve. And today you have 204,000 that have access to about 80% of all the military occupational specialties. The issue really came to bear for me back this January when the last exemptions for women serving in direct ground combat were removed by the Obama administration. Specifically, when I'm talking about direct ground combat, I'm talking about SEALs and Rangers and infantry, the people that smash heads, cut throats, really eyeball to eyeball type of fighting. And my concern, being a combatant myself with 4 infantry divisions, 3 continents, I've trained thousands of young men to do this, that a lot of young women, most young women lack the physiological and psychological makeup to do this sort of thing. And so it really puts them at a dramatic disadvantage, and as a result, puts our young men at a disadvantage when you have to force them together. But this is a political correct thing they're doing in Washington, and I just think it's wrong-headed, it's un-American, and quite frankly, it's immoral.
Colonel Maginnis, one of the things that you've done in your career is you have served as both a Ranger and you earned your airborne wings. How would having a woman serve as a Ranger in some of the Ranger teams, how would that compare to having just another guy?
Well, when you address, as I do in Deadly Consequences, the physiological distinctions, the average woman in the Army, for instance, has 37 pounds fewer muscle mass than the average man. She has about 2/3 the cardiovascular fitness, so her stamina is not the same. She has about half the upper body strength of a man. All of these issues of physiology make a big difference when we're talking about the most physically demanding job known to mankind, and that is direct ground combat, where you're literally in a death struggle, and that matters. And then, of course, the psychological differences, all of which, of course, you can attribute to the steroid testosterone, which men have 10 times more than women.
Talking to Robert Maginnis, U.S. Army retired, and he has written a book called Deadly Consequences, How Cowards Are Pushing Women into Combat. It's published by Regnery. Excellent book, and is available everywhere. Was there anybody when the Obama administration... So you're saying to me that President Obama and his team pushed for this, women in combat?
Well, absolutely. They're pushing for women in, not just women in combat, but women in the eyeball to eyeball, the worst of all combatant environments, where the SEALs and the Rangers and the infantry are,
right,
literally smashing heads and cutting throats. That's the sort of combat. We're not talking about flying jets. We're not talking about being a combatant here on a ship. I'm talking about, eyeball to eyeball sort of stuff. Well, that's very different.
Why would knowing the physiological differences between a man and a woman, which are obvious, mm-hmm. and which you mentioned earlier, why would President Obama and his team push for this, knowing the things that you've mentioned, which basically They're violating common sense.
Well, common sense, as you well know, is not a strong point of this administration. But the reality is that you've got the media. The mainstream media is infatuated by the idea that a 100-pound woman can manhandle several 200-pound men on television in the movies, and so it's fictionalized really what we're talking about here. And of course, then you have the radical feminists who really believe that women are second-class citizens in the armed forces, and because they can't be up front smashing heads and so forth, they're willing to take a significant deterioration in our readiness and our effectiveness as combatants in order to allow women to have this so-called privilege. And, of course, this privilege goes with a lot more women in body bags than I think ultimately the draft for all of our daughters and sisters and mothers, which is, I think, the height of lunacy by not only this administration, but I hold Congress and the senior leaders of the Pentagon here directly accountable.
Colonel Maginnis, let me ask you this, too, related to that. Aren't there physical tests that are done that the people who are trying to get into these programs, like Rangers and SEALs and other elite forces, they have to pass in order to be eligible? Mm-hmm. I mean, so wouldn't that process screen out the women who are not as strong as the men physically?
Well, it certainly should. That is, they don't change it. But General Dempsey said back in January that his intent is to force the services to tell him why the standards are as high as they are. Of course, they're high because they're combat tested, and we aren't short of men. But he says, no, we're going to re-examine all the standards. So all the services are coming in and trying to explain why it's so high. And the veiled implication is that all the standards are on the table. They will all be watered down to the point in which we can assess more women into these positions, not because we're short men and not because the enemy is going to also accommodate by reducing their standards and having weaker men and women on the front line.
This is the program, Today's Issues on American Family Radio. I'm Jim alongside Tim, and our guest is Colonel Robert Maginnis. And Colonel, as we're looking at this, I had a thought, and with the way our society is moving, with what President Obama has done to open up homosexuality in the military. By the way, we're talking about your book, Deadly Consequences, How Cowards Are Pushing Women into Combat. And looking at our society as a whole and the way that it's just continues to downgrade, if you will, what's going to happen because we have this now in some of our schools where the kids are getting to choose their gender. They can choose to be a guy.
On whatever day they want.
On whatever day, yeah. So what's going to happen as this goes forward, and again, this is a completely left field question, but when a man chooses to say, okay, I want to test for the Rangers as a woman, but so that they'll have a little more, they have a little more slack.
You'll probably downgrade the standard altogether is what you're talking about,
yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah, there's no doubt. That's exactly what they're going to do. They're going to downgrade the standard. So, a lot of men cannot make this.
Right.
My Ranger class, about half of us made it. And that's after being weeded out initially by the standards test that we had to take. So you're just going to have a watered-down, capable military force. And, of course, then the question is, of course, our adversaries are not going to water down their teams. It's like you're taking a very good college football program. You name the top college football program in the country, and then all of a sudden you're forced to have 3 women in the front line. But the other teams that you're playing will not. Mm-hmm. They will have the meanest, biggest, earliest guys on the front line. And what will happen, of course, the team with the 3 women in the front line, I don't care where they came from, the probabilities are that they're not going to be nearly as strong as who they oppose, and so they're going to get run over and they're going to lose all their games. Is that what we want for America? And I think that that's fundamentally what we're facing. But, certainly from a Christian perspective, we are moving to the point where we're going to, I think, ultimately draft our daughters. And this is why. Under the 1981 Rosker v. Goldberg Supreme Court decision, which upheld the 1971 Selective Service Act, which says all 18-year-old boys have to sign up for selective service. Well, that is now wiped away. The gender-only, male-only selective service is going to be out the window because there's no restriction now to women serving anywhere they want to. So as a direct result, we will, in the matter of, I would say, no less or no more than 3 years, we will have women signing up like our boys, 18-year-olds. Now, look at the world. Look at these tinderbox, North Africa, the Middle East. Look at China, a very serious, emerging, polar power. The Russians are reemerging with Vladimir Putin. There are trouble spots everywhere. And then, of course, Al-Qaeda, by the way, is not dead, very alive, as we have seen. Then you consider what they're doing to our Pentagon. I'm standing outside the Pentagon today. We're devastating our fighting ability. So what happens when you devastate your fighting ability, you devastate your all-volunteer force, you're going to have to, in a crisis, which is inevitable in the future, you're going to have to revert to selective service. And then you can't discriminate between boys and girls in selective service in the future, so women will inevitably have to fill the ranks of the cannon fodder, the infantry, which I have many years of serving in.
This is the program, Today's Issues on American Family Radio. Our guest is Colonel Robert Maginnis, and we're talking about his book, How Consequences, How Cowards Are Pushing Women into Combat. I am having a tough time today, folks, and I apologize, trying to keep my words straight. But Colonel Maginnis, one of the things we don't want to do is to devalue the service that women have done for our country over the years. That's not what this book is about, is it?
Not at all. I celebrate in the book a number of chapters on the great, loyal, and gallant service of many of our young women. I don't want to denigrate that. I want to promote it. But at the same time, I also want to preserve their lives, and I want to preserve the readiness of the armed forces, which I see as desperately in trouble if we go down this particular path. The military needs more women. They really do. But it costs twice as much to recruit a woman as it does a man. And they tend to leave the service much faster in basic training. And then even young officers, according to Rand Corporation, they're promoted at the same rate, but they leave earlier. In many cases, for logical things. They have babies, they get married, they have all these issues, and they say, no, this is not the environment I want. It's not very feminine. They want to do something else in life. So we really have a tough time retaining quality women.
As overall, by the way, where can people get a copy of your book, Deadly Consequences?
Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and also you can go online at deadlyconsequencesbook.com and get a free chapter.
Why do you call the people who are pushing for this, that is women in combat, and especially as it relates to these special forces you mentioned, SEALs, Rangers, etc., why do you call them cowards, the ones who are pushing for this?
Well, first of all, they are cowards. They're cowards because in Congress, first of all, you have a quarter of the members of Congress have any military experience. Only a little handful understand when I'm talking about the direct ground combat smashing heads. So it's a cowardice of silence. They aren't even questioning. There hasn't been a hearing in the full Armed Services Committee in 34 years in this issue, and yet here we are on the verge of sending our daughters into a very, very dangerous place. The Senate hasn't had one in 23 years. So, I think they're guilty of a cowardice of silence. And so are the senior generals. They're just kind of kowtowing to the Obama administration. These are my peers. I went to West Point with them. They know the things that I know, though they haven't experienced, because none of them are infantrymen like I am. So they have a very different perspective, but they're willing to send their daughters into the most dangerous place of all that mankind knows, and yet they aren't even considering alternatives here. I just find it unconscionable, and like I said, un-American and immoral.
This is the program, Today's Issues. Our guest is Colonel Robert Maginnis, and we're talking about his book, Deadly Consequences, How Cowards Are Pushing Women into Combat. Colonel Maginnis, you keep referring to direct and high-intensity hand-to-hand combat, where and again, no disrespect to the women who have served, but I think your illustration of the football team was great, because if they wind up going into hand-to-hand combat,